Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. I'm so excited about tonight. I've been wanting to get more arts in our program and so pleased about this particular guest. Before we start, I just wanted to go over a few points of, I'll say, flow and respect, because none of us really like the word rules, I think. This is a positive, safe space for autistic voices first. Many people here have PTSD. Sometimes that manifests in slower processing, which is also a general autistic trait for some of us. And this can make it a challenge for people to share with the group. So please raise your hand with the icon or wave in the screen to take a turn. We're a relational people and it's easy to go far afield, but we do try to stay in the ballpark of the presenter's subject. Please limit your remarks to around a minute so that we have plenty of time for the guest collaborator and other people to fully engage. This is very important. I know we all get excited and want to elaborate, but if we can work together that way, that would be great. If you have already spoken, please give generous room for other people to process and join the conversation. Even periods of silence are good for that. We ask that people stay away from incendiary subjects. People are more than welcome to schedule their own sessions that invite discussion around more difficult topics. Some people communicate primarily or exclusively through writing, so please respect the chat feature. If you communicate through the chat and want us to read your question or comment out loud, just put read, the word read at the beginning. And lastly, we ask that people put themselves on mute when they're not speaking, since many of us have auditory processing challenges. And with that, I'm so pleased to hand it over to the brilliant and capable Nathan.
Thank you all for being here. Let's see, finding my notes here. I'm not the most fluent speaker, which may seem counterintuitive for somebody who writes poetry, but wrote some notes to get us started, and also I wanted to say I do have situational mutism, so I get very nervous speaking, but then uh, I'd have all kinds of opportunities to speak. And it's just something that, like, over the course of my life, even before I knew I was autistic, I would have, go into poetry readings. I just, kept standing up to read poems, however awkward it was. Um, and, um, folks were generous and always appreciated the poetry. But anyway, I'm really grateful to be here, and hope you all are settling into a cozy holiday season so far. I actually have my house slippers on, uh, so definitely in it's really cold here. It was below freezing during the day, and it's supposed to get down. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. It's supposed to be a low of 14 degrees overnight. But anyway, a little bit about myself. In 2017, I was diagnosed as ADHD and dyscalculic and dyslexic. And then I was looking at a book that was by two autistic authors, And the reason I picked it up is because it said on the back, um, if you have ADHD, check out this book. And just looking at the first chapters where each author was describing their childhood, I thought that sounds very much like my childhood. So then I went and got an assessment, and um, I think I filled out um, the questionnaire, um, really aced, really aced it, scored high on it, and it took the clinical psychologist that I had the appointment with like 45 minutes of chatting, if that, to very confidently give her diagnosis. But anyway, ADHD, autistic, dyscalculic, dyslexic, and then I pretty much figure I don't have an official diagnosis on these, but I pretty much figure I'm dysgraphic because unless I carefully write one letter at a time, I can't even read my own handwriting. And then also dyspraxic. And the best example that I have of that is I literally spilled coffee on the ceiling one time. I was walking along um, with a cup of coffee, and it started to slip out of my hand, and then I managed to catch it. And the way that I caught it caused the coffee to shoot up in the air and hit the ceiling and then rain down on me. I was standing there wondering how I had done that. But anyway, and then situational mutism, as I mentioned, and also written expression disorder, which uh, uh, can come with dysgraphia. Um, but anyway, being undiagnosed and unsupported, I was lucky to graduate high school and unable to get a college education. So learned poetry and other things independently, basically reading and writing wherever my curiosity took me. And then as far as poetry goes, about 10 years ago, I started sending poems out for publication. I'd always liked the idea of having poems published, but I have had no idea how to do it and or what to do. And my spouse came across one of my notebooks, and I read a few poems out of it. And uh, after hearing them, she said, "These poems are so good, I'm going to divorce you if you don't start submitting them." So that's how I got into submitting poetry. But anyway, despite learning poetry independently, my poetry has caught on. Uh, I started noticing right away, like usually with editors and readers who are hyper educated. So, most of the time, editors who accepted my poems for publication had Ivy or other elite school education, um, in sharp contrast to myself, um, with no college education at all. And then one exception to this is neurodivergent and queer people often like my poetry also. I think appreciating the strangeness um, and maybe other things as well. So today I thought that I'd read some poems, um, but before I do, I'd like to briefly mention how discovering neurodivergence gave me a way to begin writing about reading and writing poetry as an autistic person and a learning disabled person. So the first two papers that I wrote it really was a complete fluke that I saw somebody who was running a seminar at University of Pennsylvania and was looking for folks to participate. So I just, on a whim, sent a message and said, I've never written a paper before, but I'd be happy to give it a try. Um, so I got into this seminar lineup um, and wrote um, a paper looking at how modernism allowed poets of the time who were neurodivergent in different ways to um, uh, have a whole lot more room to celebrate their neurodivergence in their poetry. And an example I used in this first paper um, is how the poet William Butler Yeats, who is believed to have been quite dyslexic. For example, he once wrote a letter asking about possibly working as a professor, um, and he misspelled the word professor in his sort of cold inquiry letter. He went on to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature and was also a senator in Ireland. He's a very beloved poet, but he wrote poetry in a traditional way that mostly concealed his dyslexia, just kind of sticking to rhyme and meter, misspellings, and grammatical things would be corrected by himself eventually or by an editor before anybody, before readers saw his poetry. And then in contrast, E. Cummings, who was also believed to have been dyslexic, in fact, the Cummings scholar J. Alison Rosenblit, who was kind of like she did pretty much all of her education, like undergrad, graduate, PhD at Oxford University, and then wrote a big kind of long, long monograph on Cummings, also published by Oxford University Press. But in the introduction to this book, she mentions in the course of her research of Cummings' writings, looking at his papers and seeing all the misspellings and especially on handwritten pages, he would start off too far from the left margin, writing really big, and then the writing would get smaller and smaller. And then to fit the line on the page like he wanted to, he would start to go up and writing tinier and tinier. And that's something as a dyslexic person that I did, especially as a child. He kept the habit as an adult to had a Harvard education and was an established and well-known poet. Um, I'm not sure how to. I'm not super familiar with Zoom or sure how to screen share, but I did have a. Um, there's a poem that if in case I can't figure it out, there's this poem called Grasshopper by E. Cummings, and it's really easy to find just by Googling E. Cummings and Grasshopper. And he's got the letters out of order, um, and all the letters that spell the word grasshopper are totally out of order and held together by, there's a hyphen in between each letter. And then Uh, the word is repeatedly misspelled in different ways throughout the poem, and words of other phrases or passages of the poem are just kind of jumping through each other. I wish I knew how to screen share.
Hey,
What
Nathan,
would I go under
yeah,
to
there
do?
should be a green button. There's probably a green button at the bottom, towards the bottom of your screen
Oh,
that
I see
says,
it. Share
yeah. So if you click
screen.
on that, then a screen should come up and you can pick which screen you want to share and just click on that.
Okay, let me make this big first. Um, and then do this. Then I guess it would just be desktop one. Uh, no.
Are you clicking the green button?
I did, and it's got different options like
Okay,
desktop
so
one.
so which one of those looked like the screen you wanted to share? I think it should be like a palette of different windows that you might
Oh,
have
what
open.
do you? Well, when I click share, it says allow Zoom to share your screen, open
Yes.
system preferences. Uh, oh, maybe if I do this. Uh, I'm not sure. Anyway, I can put a link to the poem at the Academy of American Poets website. I can put that in the chat, and then Roger, would you maybe be able to figure out how to share it if I do that?
Yeah, sure. I think if you put the link, I can click on it and I can share my screen, and so people
Okay.
can see it. There you go. All right, let's try this. All right, is that it?
Yeah, that's the complete poem right there.
Right here. Okay.
Um, so he kind of has different phrases, and if you sit with it, you can see what the poem is saying. It's nothing especially complex. I don't remember what it is at this point. This is a poem that I covered in another um, paper a few years after that first one that I wrote. But anyway, this I think gives an idea of um, how I think once somebody knows that like if you're looking at Cummings as a dyslexic poet, this to me is a great example of him celebrating his way of processing and experiencing language um, in this little poem about a grasshopper. Anyway, that um, so that kind of shows gives an idea of that shift from um, traditional approach to poetry or the traditional episteme to modernist episteme, and how that allowed new possibilities for many writers, including um, poets like Cummings, who is obviously seems obvious to me, reveling in and celebrating his dyslexia in this poem and so many other poems of his. And then other papers and essays and things that I went on to write or have gone on to write explored the works of John Clare, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, Geoffrey Hill, um, Lucia Perillo, Charles Bernstein, Torrin A. Greathouse, Kay Ivor, Ina Carino, Nazifa Islam, and numerous other poets. And then at some point in the middle of focusing on works of other neurodivergent poets, I began organizing panels and working with a few academics who have helped moderate reading and paper panels at conferences, where that lets me do behind the scenes things and perhaps even present on the panel. And then somebody else who has an easier time speaking to an audience, kind of steps in to moderate. Um, and this has also led to some preliminary work with a neurodivergent friend toward gathering poetry and poetry scholarship by autistic and other neurodivergent folks in an anthology, although we have not yet begun looking for a publisher. I think we're both just kind of sitting with things and mulling things. And then finally, I also added a small literary journal called Queerly, and have guest edited for journals and meet regularly with autistic and other neurodivergent poets to talk about poetry and life and pretty much anything and everything. Um, and then, now I'll read a few poems and be happy to respond to questions as well as I'm able to, just keeping in mind my difficulties with processing language and speech. Um, Especially I find not not being in physical space with folks, like I have really uh, run into more challenges, I think, in this kind of virtual format, which may be totally the opposite for other folks and other neurodivergent and autistic folks. But
Hey Nathan, just a quick question in the chat. Can you
yeah.
repeat the name of the journal that you mentioned previously?
Oh, the journal is called Queerly.
Clearly. Okay. Thanks.
Oh, I do have I also pulled up a few poems by a couple other poets. So maybe I'll start by reading this poem by a poet that I found out about him through um, the poet John Ashbery had done this um, series of lectures, and they were collected into like all the lectures. Uh, I think it was a lecture series at Harvard University where he had gone to the school, and for undergrad at least. Um, and he was giving this lecture series, and the press there, um, as he described it in his introduction, they were very patient with him. Like, I think years went by, and eventually that, he managed in the middle of a busy schedule to, and, you know, writing voluminously as he did, to get everything edited so that the lecture notes could come out as a book. And it's a little book called Other Traditions, by John Ashbery. And he writes about, sort of, he looks at poetry in off the beaten track kind of ways. And that's the sort of the core, um, meaning of the title. But he writes about a few neurodivergent poets, not directly, not using the term neurodivergence, but he writes about John Clare and this poet named Thomas Lovell Beddoes, and also on, um, the Academy of American Poets site. Uh, I'll try to put this in the chat too. Um, yeah, there's a poem called A Crocodile. And this is a poem that's, um, mm, in, in terms of accuracy and so forth, it's, um, basically, it seems that he has read about a crocodile, but he's never seen one. He's never been to the Nile. So the presentation of the crocodile ends up being really fanciful and, to me, delightfully strange. It's also wildly inaccurate. Um, but anyway, this poem, A Crocodile, hard by the lilied Nile, I saw a duskish river dragon stretched along, the brown habergeon of his limbs enameled with sanguine almandines and rainy pearl, and on his back there lay a young one sleeping, no bigger than a mouse, with eyes like beads, and a small fragment of its speckled egg remaining on its harmless, pulpy snout, a thing to laugh at as it gaped to catch the balking merry flies in iron jaws, or in the iron jaws of the great devil beast, like a pale soul fluttering in rocky hell, lightsomely flew the snowy Atroclus with roseate beak tearing the hairy leeches from his throat. So I meant to say before reading, that Beddoes is very much like John Clare, is very much thought to have been bipolar, which to me, situates him under the umbrella of neurodivergence. And I think, um, this is such a delightfully strange poem that, um, even though it's written in more of a traditional format, I think it still conveys, Beddoes's neurodivergence. And then there's another poem here. I know I'm talking about, sort of across the range of variations of neurodivergence. There's a poem here by Les Murray, an Australian poet who passed away a few years ago, maybe several years ago at this point. Um, I promise I'll read some of my own poems after after this one. But
Don't worry about it. I really like hearing about the interesting ways of how neurodivergent poems have influenced poetry.
so this poem is called Wee Bill. Caught a wee bill in my car grill. Bird twice the weight of a hefty beetle. Only heard it when I left the bush. That's a very Australian word usage there. Only heard it when I left the bush. If it couldn't home, it would likely perish. Extracted, it whirred off, copse and hollow. I couldn't drive after it, couldn't follow its speed among parrots and bigger birds. I braked and said a line of words, all wasted. Its cohort would supply its brood with forage if it should die. If not, it would announce its own homecoming, relearning how to slow and sing. So this is another poem that I wrote about in a recent presentation that I gave actually in Boston earlier this year. Um, and I like um, the slow pace of the poem, how the speaker is, has been in the bush. Les Murray actually wasn't, as an autistic person, he very much preferred being in the bush and, wasn't the biggest fan of the city. But it seems that he had driven out to the bush and is perhaps coming back to the city or, in the vicinity of it at least. And then he notices this bird caught in the grill of his car. And it seems that he's thinking um, basically the distance traveled from when the bird is caught in the grill, how will it ever make its way back um, to its mate, to its nest, and so forth. But you know, melancholy poem, I suppose, but it just is a poem that, um, being autistic myself, just like with the the poem Grasshopper by Cummings, being dyslexic, I just really feel a connection with the way that like what is talked about, and then in both cases these kind of small creatures that um, it's so easy to not slow down and notice. Um, Well, I've got a few of my own poems that I can read, starting with this one here. Um, this is a poem that was in, I had two kind of um, monster themed or kind of spooky. The other poem was kind of spooky, but in the October issue of Poetry Magazine a few years back, both poems um, were included. Uh, Keeping to the spirit of the holiday, and let, let's see. But I write a lot, and this is a poem that when I give readings, folks often want to hear it, and um, it, it's been amazing, all the different responses that this poem has gotten. But this is called Bee Monster. All mouth, out of orbit due to an insatiable need to be orbited. At some point, there are clouds or waves filled with the foul kelp of cornering questions. Like a black hole eating a star through space, it was real when Monster queried, "Why do you think you carry a small stack of books with you?" Out of orbit is perhaps a phantasmagoria of blankness. It was real when the foolishness I was meant to feel oozed from the kelp instead. What I carried out of my own need was innocuous enough. It felt how pages smelled as I turned them. Like Don Quixote made a helmet, I wanted to make the books, with their sturdy covers, a shield. I succeeded, almost. Almost, except an impulse rose as I walked starrily away from Monster. Almost, except it is impossible to protect what I was protecting indefinitely. Naivety that is ready to crumble does. When it crumbles, its pieces fall into a womb where the thing most feared gestates. All mouth, all hunger, all claw, all tooth, all stir of disorder, I now will be, hidden and large, large, large as the thick-haired ocean of space. So this poem is, I have a collection that is due out. I haven't heard a release date from the publisher, but it's on contract to be published by April of next year, and it has 100 poems in it, mostly short, 14-line sonnet length poems, and they're arranged alphabetically by title. And the book's called The Importance of Being Feeble-Minded, and then it has quotes at the front that kind of um, um, loosely trace the history of the use of that term, and then sort of um, the initial appearance of the term in the 1500s translation of the Tyndale Bible. Um, there's a Bible verse and one of the uh, books of Thessalonians that uses the phrase comfort the feeble-minded. and then sort of jump forward to Calicax of Kansas report on the Commission for the Provision of the Feeble-Minded, and have sort of a longer quote from that laying out basically 100 years ago the medical science understanding of autistic and intellectually disabled people. And anyway, I really wanted to use the term, but present poetry that I hope really works to I suppose that quote from the Calicax of Kansas report to especially sort of give the lie to how um, mm, ridiculous, I suppose, that uh, eugenics uh, it, uh, mindset is. But anyway, uh, I could read a couple more poems here. Um,
Yeah, I want to hear more poems. I thought that was really cool.
this is a poem that was published um, the Academy of American Poets does a series called Poem a Day, where there's a poem by a contemporary poet Monday through Friday, and then whoever is curating for the month for Saturdays and Sundays, they'll sort of dip back into poetry of the past and publish works by um, um, those poets over the weekend. Anyway, this poem is called "The Genie Speaks." I don't want to say anything about my poems because I'm mostly just curious what um, uh, everybody else might think, and what kinds of things you all may see in the poems. Um, so the genie speaks. I will start again tomorrow after waking under the fingernails of Scheherazade. Small things will become large, and large things will become themselves. It is an old story and familiar, despite how much I hate being divided. Here I am, despite how much I should not be. At this moment, I am reaching far into a page that is oozing like honeycomb. If you will pardon my hyperbole, there are leaves of something that matters. I do not know what, blowing in every direction. At the foretold moment, our other earth opens a secret hand. If there is a purpose, we will know it soon enough, although not knowing feels satisfactory and good, better than good, I am tempted to say to the bees. So this poem, the day that it published just coincidentally, I do travel a bit, but I don't do a huge amount of traveling. But I posted the poem on social media, and headed to the airport, and it was due to go uh, to be at a conference at Amherst College and visit Emily Dickinson's house while I was in Amherst, and had kind of um, an adventuresome trip. Like, it took a bit longer than I thought that it would to get there. I got settled in, and then got to my Airbnb um, in Amherst, and it was just a charming little town for anybody who hasn't been. If you get a chance to go, it's um, I enjoyed it, but um, I got there and um, got to my Airbnb and thought I should check my social media before I go to bed, and it turns out that folks had shared the poem. Some of my favorite writers were sharing it around on Twitter, and um, it was really great to see the responses. But one that meant a lot to me was um, like the poet Carl Phillips, who's very much a favorite poet, had um, tweeted it, and then uh, reading the comments was just really heartwarming, as I was off in a strange place, charming though it was, and away from home, and mingling with strangers at this conference. But one of the comments underneath Carl's tweet to share the poem was, somebody said it took a lot of guts to break the stanza right in the middle of the word like that, the word honeycomb. Um, so um, uh, well, that's a little bit of, I guess, the kind of journey that a poem can take. Uh, Having somebody want to include something that you've written in an anthology. I think, for some poets, sometimes one or two of their poems will be so popular that they can't hold back from saying, I've written all kinds of other poems, and they kind of seem to uh, be somewhat irked by how popular, like, one particular piece can be. So, but I haven't run into that scenario with on this poem, at least. Um, and maybe would it make sense to read one more? Maybe. This poem, like with The Genie Speaks, it's written in the 14-line constraint. Often sonnets are written in 14 lines. Maybe this is a sonnet, but this poem is called The Winter, and it was, I think, also published last year. And all three of these poems so far will be in my book when it's available. Anyway, this poem says, "We were arguing to find out what our real feelings could be. I placed large olives on every other fingertip. You felt the preciousness of the air around your second pair of ears. It was spring until it wasn't. I never knew people like you could do the things you do, you said. Then a knife opened in the heart of your mind. The winner will have to die first, I said. Then you win, you said. Thank you, I said. I always wanted to be first at something." So a lot of times when I write, I don't have anything in particular in mind. I'm not writing toward a theme or, setting out to say something linear. Um, it's more like, like if you were going for a walk in a city and then something catches your attention and you turn down an alleyway and then that leads you somewhere and you end up a park and um, think, well, maybe I'll try going down this trail. I've never been there before. So that's I like to write to see what happens. But I do think that something about this poem to me seems kind of melancholy, even though it's called The Winter. Um, uh, it feels sad to me. Um, and then maybe I could read one more poem. Um, so one of my favorite websites for you know, poetry and other things spirituality related is this website, grateful.org. And the Grateful Living community is based on some of the insights and teachings of this a monk named Brother David Stendelrast. And the main sort of meditative or contemplative practice that he recommends is cultivating gratitude or gratefulness, and sort of a three-step approach of stop, look, and go. So stop, look, go. And you can learn about it on the site. I think on the homepage, there's like an introductory video, but the site also has a poetry column, and I was super excited. Like, this is maybe an outlet for poetry that is not as well known as Academy of American Poets or Poetry Magazine or one of the um, uh, sort of big outlets for poetry. But I think being able to contribute a poem to this website, I was just really thrilled to do it. And the way that I came to write this poem is uh, I work, I have a work from home job um, for a large healthcare company. I work as an analyst. And one of the things that the HR manager got into doing when we were all together at the office was like he asked me the first year that I was with the company if I would write a Thanksgiving poem that he could send out to everybody um, ahead of the holiday. And I did it for several years, and then the department that I'm in ended up kind of in a crack of we're between um, the umbrella that we were previously under as a department, and then like kind of in between that and corporate offices in a indescribable space of our own. But anyway, this is one of the poems that I wrote. I think the last Thanksgiving poem that I wrote, and I was actually sitting right in this exact corner when I wrote the poem. We had a Thanksgiving cactus that was just starting to bloom as I sat down needing to write something so that uh, the HR manager could mail it out to everybody. But this is the Thanksgiving cactus. Here in a chair in a cozy corner of this room, under the glow of a lamp, with the sun replaced by the moon, hanging boldly in the sky, I pause to consider the small pink buds of a toothed cactus. And I pause to consider the moon as well, although it is too far away to touch. And in my pausing, I feel as if I am a wave on the ocean, or a seed pulsing in a warmer season. Now that the leaves have gone from most of the trees, now that frost dusts the brittle grass most mornings, now that weather keeps us more indoors, so that we are more able to be together, even more together, even during moments in lamplight like this one. And I've got one more thing. It's just um, an image that I might put in the chat. I had a mini interview earlier this year in a magazine called Blue Mountain Review. And let's see. Well, I'm not sure that I can figure out how to put this in the chat, but it's a JPEG file. It doesn't want me to do it, but um, anyway, it's an excerpt from like the magazine put it together for their social media, and it's has my name and a photo and then a quote from this mini interview. And it just says, I'm ADHD, autistic, dyslexic, and have written expression disorder. So my poems are implicitly expressive of these, while explicitly they explore nature and human nature, protecting and uplifting the heart in a world that can be deeply and systemically cynical is central to my poems, and I think has been from the beginning. Um,
Hey, Nathan, if you want to just email that to me real quick, if you can, I can easily.
oh, yeah, awesome. Okay, that is perfect, actually. And that's all I have poetry wise, actually.
This was absolutely thrilling, Nathan. I'm just blown away. I'm so happy you're here. I loved everything you shared with us. I'm really hoping that you and I can work together to be sure that autistic literature makes it into our program more often. I know you've got lots of contacts and just be great to get more people and you to come share more of the autistic literature that's blossoming out there.
Yeah, I know I mentioned some older kind of traditional episteme poets, but yeah, there are so many contemporary writers younger than myself, and I think that creative areas like poetry is such a great um, um, niche kind of space for neurodivergent people. Um,
I like it especially that it seems to be blossoming at a time that we're more aware of autistic culture as something that binds us, a way of being in the world. And so our art and our literature, the way it speaks to each of us, the way that we share it in unique ways is really important, I think.
mhm. Y- Yes, I agree. And I think, like with poetry, for example, I feel like, um, especially with poets of the past, where there can be a consensus that this person was probably um, neurodivergent and some kind of way. We have better, more detailed language for different variations of neurodivergence now, but I'm very interested in, and that this is why I picked a few, um, well, at least um, the Beddoes poem, he was writing in the 1700s, so it's an old poem. Les Murray is more contemporary, but I'm very interested in older neurodivergent literature because I think that um, it's been read through a neuronormative lens and needs to be reread in light of, you know, for example, I've read the poetry of E. Cummings since my late teens, and it wasn't until a couple until more recently that I came across scholarship that J. Allison Rosenblatt's mention of, well, I meant to say, I think I might have gotten sidetracked from what I was saying by myself, but uh, in the introduction to her monograph on Cummings, she mentioned his dyslexia and that she wanted to write about it more. So what she ended up doing is collaborating with somebody who was a specialist and giving dyslexia assessment and diagnosis. And together, they wrote this paper called um, E. Cummings and Dyslexia or something like this. And they, with the help of this qualified professional, they concluded that he was moderately to mildly dyslexic. So, I think at least with poets who may not have received a diagnosis, or maybe they lived before a diagnosis existed, especially once there's developing consensus, then um, it's there's a lot of opportunity to look over that um, that poet's works again and their body of work, and uh, see it in a new light, see it, see it, basically reread it in light of um, likely neurodivergence, and that way the it gives sort of to me a larger context for contemporary writers who are more openly saying, I write this way because I'm autistic and proud of it. Or, yeah, that poem, I'll have some poems of my own. I'll start a sentence, I'll be talking about something, and then it might even stop mid-sentence and then just start talking about something else because being an ADHDer, that's part of how my brain works. And um, yeah, there's actually this great quote. Well, not so much a quote, but this scholar was studying the diaries of the scientist Michael Faraday, who is um, he b believed to have been dyslexic, and I bookmarked if I got a chance to read this paragraph. Um, but what this person studying the diaries of Faraday wrote, it says the diary entries have the familiar and irritating form of ideas jotted down, repeated, and forgotten. There are only brief episodes of reasoning, and not all of these are in the same line of thought. I realized that this lack of pattern was not an irritating failure to be ordered. It was itself the evidence of how Faraday thought. The prejudice which had prevented my understanding was the idea that Faraday's thinking must have had a single coherent framework. It did not. Faraday thought about and worked at various notions of lateral action without elevating any idea to the status of framework. This clarification took place not by rational analysis of any prior thoughts, but by a quite different mode of thinking, a selection of thought. From the morass of articulated and unarticulated principles, concepts, observations, and physical facts, Faraday suspended the need to understand and simply acknowledged the thoughts that came into his head. The coherence of ideas was not imposed by any prior framework, but was allowed to emerge from the chaos of thoughts he experienced. So I think that strikes me as very insightful about how neurodivergence can work, and
Yeah,
also applicable
doing
to.
our own.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, doing our own archaeology, the archaeology of autistic culture is thrilling. Do you have a time to take a couple of quick questions if anyone
Oh,
has?
yes. Yeah,
That would be
absolutely.
great. Okay, everybody, if you have a question for Nathan, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand through the icon or just wave into the frame, and Roger can make sure that you get your question out there to Nathan.
Great. I have a comment that requesting to be read. This is by a thank you, Monster, The Genie Speaks, The Winner, The Thanksgiving Cactus, all among my favorite poems of yours. Went delightfully situational mute at the announcement of your upcoming book. Stumbling for words. I can say I love how you spill coffee. I think that is the secret autistic handshake. So proud you are in the autodidactic
Autodidactic.
club. Sorry. Yeah, here we go. And here in the poems, every word resonates. Thank you for sharing all of this. And a thank you from thanks, Nathan. Good hearing your stuff. Hope to catch you somewhere in person. Uh, and thank you, Nathan, for sharing. Came a little late, but glad I got to hear some.
You're on. Thank you. You're still on. Well, if anybody has a question or two, like I said, I'll be happy to try to respond. Poetry is because it's such a space for not being linear. Like you don't have to have a beginning, middle, and end. Hmm,
Do you
to
find
me, like, oh, go ahead.
do you find that you experience a significant amount of synchronicity between your life and your work? And I don't mean just inspirationally, but in a spookier way, in a more holographic sense.
Yes, yeah. There's actually this. I don't have the quote at hand, but I have a book of letters to and from John Keats. It's like selected letters, and he was friends with this poet or not a poet, a painter whose last name was Hayden, and he was writing Hayden. So this is sort of in the middle of whatever letter exchange they had going at the time, and he was saying, um, remember how we talked about the presiding spirit, like kind of this old idea, um, and he said, dare I presume that mine is Shakespeare? And then he said, because things that I write only half aware um, come out to be correct in a dozen features of propriety. So, in other words, he's not really thinking about how he's putting the poem together, but once he's finished writing it and looks back over it, he sees all kinds of things that were definitely not in his mind, or not at the front of his mind as he was writing it. So that's something that I experience a lot. Just uh, mm, I'm not sure, but it's more, I'm not sure what it's going to come to until I've done it. So another thing that I think a lot about is um, the poet Robert Frost, who I have written about as possibly an ADHD-er. Um, he gave have this book of really like transcriptions of really wonderful rambly talks that he gave, like when he went to school. All of this is classic neurodivergent. Like when he was younger and in school, he got kicked out for daydreaming in class. Um, and then, but when he went to college, like he went to um, Harvard and dropped out, and then he went to Dartmouth and also dropped out, I think. But later on, as a late bloomer, famous poet, like he wrote a book when he was about 40. Like he had been living with his family in England and moved back to New England, back to the States and to New England, and wrote this book called A Boy's Will that was, got maybe a couple reviews. And then he just doubled down and wrote a book called North of Boston. And that's where his career um, took off. But once he was famous, he would be invited to Dartmouth and like the kinds of places that he had dropped out of to talk to students. And one of his, like I said, delightfully rambly talks, he rhetorically asked his audience of students, like, what department would you say that poetry has the most in common with? And he paused for a bit and he said, because I'd say it's um, the athletic department. And, that poetry involves a kind of prowess. So that's another thing that struck me. And, over the years of reading perspectives and thoughts of poets, that it seems very much like that to me, that I'll write something really as a single draft, and I don't, being untrained, I don't have any concept of like how to work on a poem. So it's more um like you're doing an athletic routine, like um being like a gymnast or something like that. It only happens one time, and then if I have in mind, the thought to try to write another sonnet or something, like usually in the first line or two, I get a sense of what I want the poem to look like on the page, and then just do that. And then when I get to the end of the 14th line, that has to be the end of the poem. And the ADHD part of my like neurodivergent bouquet is, um, I can't wait to finish. Like, as I can, see that, the end of the last line coming. Like, I start like really thinking like this is drug on for too long, even though it's, like typically the poems are written in about 5 minutes, or like I'll pause and close the notebook, close my phone, close the laptop, and then think of the next thing, and then open it back up and write that, and then pause again, and then write the next thing, and then um, yeah, it's very much, I think, like uh, oh. saying autistic waiting. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Um, I'm starting to realize that I'm late diagnosed just a few years ago of why I don't finish things, and it's just what you were talking about Robert Frost going to different colleges, and so I had read an article a couple of years ago. Somebody wrote an about autistic waiting, and what I'll find is if I have a big deal thing that's a lot of spoons, let's say camping. Maybe I'm going camping Friday, even one night, that's so hard. And so everything else has to wait. There's no spoons to process, decide, or do anything. So this is this never-ending impatient. And so yeah, like with a poem or like my school papers, my term papers were always last minute. Always last minute. And it's just this constant frustration, and it's I think par for the course. Like we just have to deal with that because our brain goes faster than our body can carry out our life or something. So I thought autistic waiting, so hashtag autistic.
I'm gonna use that if it's okay.
I'm sorry, I can't credit.
Hashtag autistic waiting. But yeah, I totally understand that. Absolutely. Um, like I'm very much, wait till the deadline is coming up. One thing that I do, like I guess, maybe it troubles it a little bit, but there's the real deadline, and then sometimes, if I've got months to do something, I'll give myself a deadline a week before the actual deadline. So that way I can potentially miss the deadline and then still be ahead of the real deadline at the same time. Uh, that's very satisfying to do, to be late and early at the same time because you've imposed a second earlier deadline on yourself.
I think for me it combines with a scheduling impairment. I have in general a scheduling impairment. I see time clairvoyantly, so calendars are really hard, and appointments are really hard, and numbers can be really hard. So last night I had a business meeting, new client, 9:15 p.m. was the time everybody involved could do it. So I just, I'm like, oh my god, what time is it? All night.
I just want to jump in and see if anyone else has a comment or a question before we let Nathan go.
I had a question, Nathan. When you mentioned when you write a poem, I think you had mentioned something about there might be some kind of a method around it that you were not formally trained in, but yet you're able to write this beautiful poetry. Um, so I'm kind of curious, like, is there a method, or is the rule like everyone does it differently, and that's part of the creative process?
Um, I think, yeah, I think everybody does things differently. So, the thing that I'm describing, uh, the best that I can figure is there is the aspect to like about 10% of autistic people, like roughly, I think, um, some of the thought out there is about 10% of us have um, savant abilities, which is not the same thing as being a savant, but there's something that we can just really, like, we really can get into and do incredibly well. Like one example that comes to mind is there's this scientist named Jacob Barnett, and he last I saw, like he was doing multiple degrees in physics and astrophysics, and what he was discovered at 10 years old. He loved math, and he would talk about math to his mother, and she didn't know what he was talking about. It was way over her head, but she knew, like, she had a very strong feeling that he knew what he was talking about. So she asked if she could record some things and put a video, at least one video up on YouTube, and then got a call from this professor at Princeton University saying, I'm really interested in things that your son is working on. And I wonder, I know it's unusual to ask, but I wonder if I might be able to talk to him about it. So then he started skipping grades in school. And by the time he was in middle school, like, he did all of his high school curricula and then started taking college courses. Um, and his math project while he was in the middle of these different degrees, last time I looked him up, is he wanted to refine the very complex math behind Einstein's formula E equals mc squared. He felt like it was a little clunky, that it could be cleaned up a little bit. I don't know if he has successfully done that, but so he had this like really uncanny ability with math, but he never learned how to tie his shoes. So he just wears slip-on shoes and hoodies. So, this man he's an adult now, and he's working to clean up uh, um, Einstein's math. He thinks that it could be maybe a little bit more elegant than it is. Also can't tie his shoes. So, uh,
Priorities.
yeah, like, I think of that a lot. Like, there are so many things that I'm absolutely horrible at. But then there are, at least a few things that I can do really, really well. Um, but I think that's, Roger, to this is all to respond to your question, that the best that I can figure is that kind of stems from that. Like, it's a passion. I can really go into hyper focus, and then in that kind of space, that's maybe like uh, a flow state, like, is talked about in psychology. Um, uh, to me, it's also slash an autistic joy state. So, like, I can feel like feelings, like it feels ecstatic, and then I start thinking it's time to wrap it up. This has drug on too long. It's been almost 5 minutes. But yeah. Is that a response to your
Oh, no,
question?
no, it
Or,
totally
like,
is, because I mean, I think, I mean, what I was getting concerned about is if people go into these colleges and universities and they're sort of told, well, this is the way you ought to go about it, and that's not how their mind works, then they can be beating themselves up
mhm,
because they're using the wrong method. Uh, so if you're neurodivergent, then uh, and you're trying to conform to that, uh, I could see that being very unproductive and probably will burn you out. Um, but if you don't know other ways to do it, then you would probably be stuck in that rut. So, like, hearing your process, I think, is really helpful for me, and to give me examples in my head as to how different creative processes work.
mhm. Yeah, I think it can be very, very different from writer to writer. Like, I have a friend, the poet Naomi Shihab Nye. Um, became pen pals, like, when I was in my early 20s, and I was horrible about writing letters, and have never really written letters to anybody except for to Naomi. And she had this approach with poetry where every morning there's a box of blank paper on her desk, and she gets up in the morning before her husband and kids got up, she would get up, sit down at the desk and just write something on a piece of paper, even if it was blah, 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 blah. And out of that came, out of that practice of doing that every morning, comes all of her beautiful poetry and books and essays and um, everything that she's done essentially, writing wise comes out of just getting up every morning and writing things down, even if it's feels boring.
That's awesome. That kind of reminds me of the Faraday example you brought up. It's very like non-linear. To the lay observer, it seems chaotic and random, but the way the mind pieces things together, I mean, who's the judge, right? Except
Mhm.
you get a product that's simply amazing.
Mhm. Yeah, he was an interesting scientist in that um, mm, he didn't think that he knew math. And then another scientist whose last name was Maxwell came along and realized Faraday indeed knew math, and he wrote out all the equations and formulas that were um, embedded in the writing and the work that Faraday had done. He just wasn't able to translate it into numbers, so um, this other scientist came along and um, did that for him.
It kind of reminds me of having the language, and sounds like autistic physics might be relevant here, Don.
Yeah, I do have an autistic poet friend who uh, has a background in math, and he actually teaches math at a Montessori school, and went to MIT and all of it, and then his poetry is very etymology based. Uh, he loves thinking about the different definitions of words and including like so many words just in common usage. The word may have um, half a dozen or more meanings, but we think that it only has one meaning from common usage. But when you really look into words, sometimes there, there's a whole lot more there. There's older usages that have gone out of vogue that when you're writing a poem, you may want to sort of reference back to um, a more archaic type usage of a word. Um, but anyway, the uh, I was just saying that because I was thinking that I wish that math was something that I understood, but I don't think I do. Not in a Faraday kind of way, like for real. Like I made F's in math, but when I was in school. Uh, in fact, like
Oh,
I had to repeat fifth grade because I got one of the 6 weeks, I think the last 6 weeks of the year, I got an F for that whole block, which meant that I couldn't advance to the next next grade.
you should come to one of our CASY physics sessions, Nathan, because it's essentially mathless physics or poetic physics, if you want to call it that.
Okay, okay, I'm intrigued.
I'll send you a link to the next one that comes up. So I'd love to see you there. and I hate for this to end, but it's been a long day for me. And oh, and looking for, if you're on the CASY page, on the Cultural Autism Studies page, I have an events under the events tab now.
Everything is
Which
listed.
page? Meetup? Meetup?
No, I don't use.
Meetup because it never works for me.
But
Yeah,
the
I don't
Facebook.
know where to go.
Okay, well, if are you on Facebook?
Is that where it is? Facebook? Oh,
Yeah, just look under Cultural Autism Studies at Yale.
I
And
think I'm on it. I just didn't know where to go. I couldn't find it.
yeah, and
Okay.
I'll be listing the next physics meeting pretty soon. It's going to be coming up, and I'll put it on the events page.
for
Oh
you.
yeah, that's so exciting. Did you have one yet?
Yes, we've had two, and it's.
Oh,
it's
okay,
been
yeah.
really
I'll
amazing.
be there. I'll find it. Yeah.
Good, I'll look for both of you then. And this has been so fantastic. It was mesmerizing listening to you, Nathan, and great discussion, everyone. Really, really pleased at getting the arts involved. Like I said, this is wonderful. All right, so hopefully we'll see you all soon at the next gathering. And until then, stay safe, and Nathan, stay warm. I'm in Southern Illinois in your area, so we get the same weather. So stay warm out there, and yeah, we'll all see each other soon, I hope.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Roger.
Have a good evening.